Share screen. PowerPoint. This is where we were at. We were looking at part D. Part D was in triode. Yes, it is. Triode. If I want to calculate the current ID, Kn prime is 200 microamps per volt squared. W over L is still 10. Now that gets multiplied by this whole thing, VGS minus VT. This is the gate, this is the drain, this is the source, this is the drain. VGS is 0.9. So 0.9 minus 0.4, 0.5 times whatever VDS is, which is 0.4, minus 1/2 VDS squared, which is 0.4 squared. Now I go through and I do that calculation, and this is for part D. And I come up with an amazing 240 microamps. Most of these transistors, you're expecting answers in milliamps and microamps. This is microelectronics, and sometimes even smaller devices down into the nanoamps. You don't, if you make kiloamps or amps, you've made a mistake. These are not power devices. That's a good time to go back and check your work.
Oh,
now,
just a quick question.
Yes, Sean.
So VTN and VT are the same thing, basically, right? Just notated different.
VTN and VTP are the same thing. If I drew it really sloppily, yeah, VTN is like VT for an NMOS transistor. And VTP is the threshold for a PMOS transistor. Now what
that's all.
Okay, and if I want to confuse you further, we'll get to this maybe next week sometime. VTN0 is a slightly different version of that. That'll fit. I should just shut up. We'll talk about that later. So what's going on here is if I'm in saturation, you can see this has absolutely no dependence on VDS. It's not in the equation. But what really happens in saturation, as the drain voltage goes up, that gate to drain starts to be below the threshold voltage. I start losing little tiny lengths of the drain because the channel is shrinking, which makes that current flatten out. Now, there's something, the argument with this equation is that the higher voltage I put across VDS increases the resistance exactly enough to keep the current constant. Well, that's not true. The current's going to go up ever so slightly. What these curves really look like when I put them on a curve tracer, and as devices got smaller and smaller, this got worse and worse. They don't look like this, where that's supposed to be a flat line. They look something more like this. And the line and the slope of that line kept getting higher and higher as the devices got smaller. So we had to take this into account. Now what they do is they take a whole bunch of these curves and they find out where this crosses the axis. And this is called VA. It's the negative of the early voltage. So the and all this is doing is modeling the slope of that line. I measure this and I put a fudge factor in here. 1 plus lambda VDS. And this is like 1 over this is like the slope of the line. And this models the fact that in saturation, and this is only a saturation effect, do never multiply the triode equation by 1 plus lambda VDS. And this is modeling the increase in current as I increase VDS. Okay, due to channel length modulation. Labs start on Friday. You got a specific data file for your team. Your team numbers have been posted to BBlearn, and you should be the only one who has access to your own personal team folder. You can either print out or annotate your lab assignment, and I will be in lab, and so that will kind of keep the confusion down. And the pre-labs due at 12:45 p.m. on Friday. Okay. Now this lambda that shows up in the equation, we got to be careful with this. Now if you're a physicist, you probably think lambda's wavelength, and that would be in meters, but that's a whole nother thing. There's two different places in microelectronics where the variable lambda gets used. There's the lambda in this ID equation. Now the lambda in this ID equation has to have units of 1/volts or volts to the -1 to make, because when I multiply it by volts, I want it to be dimensionless, so this current still remains a current. There is another lambda that has units of micrometers, and it's the minimum feature size for a process. So they are different. You have to look at the units to tell which lambda's which. And yeah, that's all I want to say. Just be careful. For right now, the only lambda we're dealing with is this one, until we get to later. The homework problems are coming out of Cedric Smith. They often specify VA, which is the early voltage, and no, that's not misspelled, Microsoft. It's actually the name of a person. This VA is like 1/lambda. That's all it is. So if I know lambda, I take 1/that, or if I want to find lambda given VA, it just invert it. Now another thing, because this is pretty common in processing technology, is that your VA is not in units of volts. It's in units of volts per micrometer. You have to multiply that VA by the channel length L to get the actual early voltage. So you may have to do that step first and then flip it over to get lambda. You'll have to do that on the homework. This is my explanatory slide because I explained it many, many times in office hours to people. So there's the channel length modulation parameter, 1 plus lambda VDS. Typical values are like from 0.05 to 0.2. It has units of per volts. We went through that. Ideally, we would want lambda equal to 0, because that would give me perfectly flat curves, which is what I want my transistors to look like. This is a deviation from ideality. Ideally, lambda equals 0, which would mean the early voltage, which is 1/lambda, would be infinity. Okay, so we've gone through, we did a couple of example problems. We did B, and what we found for B was the big ID. This part right here is what I'm going to call big ID. This is the current without channel length modulation. So the big ID for part B was 360 microamps. No! I'm having a bad day. This is exceptional. Okay, I will be back. My computer crashed. You can hear me, I know. I just can't see what's going on. 2925.